Counterpoised against this is the functionalist school, which stresses the halting, ad hoc, and improvisational character of the process of murdering Jews, and argues that deportations and extermination camps emerged as a result of an effort to increase efficiency and reduce the burden on the killers of the process of murder. Scholars have come forth with a new synthesis, articulated most clearly by Christopher Browning, which blends the two poles of this former argument, which was a fierce debate in the 80s and through the 90s, and shows how the Wannsee Conference of January 1942, which led to the Aktion Reinhardt, the stepping up of killing camps in Poland in 42 and 43, which led to the final deportations from Greece, Hungary, France, the Netherlands, and the four corners of Europe in 1944 to Belzec, Treblinka, Chelmno, and Auschwitz. The Wannsee Conference provided functional solutions to attain an intended outcome. That's the compromise. The question remains of when and whether Hitler issued a single order to proceed with the annihilation of European Jews. Christian Gerlach of the University of Bern argues for a distinct decision on December 12, 1941. This is a position shared by few other historians, but there's not a consensus counter-argument with a different time. Whatever the position of the correctness of Gerlach's thesis, the Wannsee Conference 6 weeks later, on January 20th, 1942, certainly laid the plan that the Germans followed consequently until the extermination camps began to be liberated in February 1945. So September 1st, 1939, both culminated an unfinished crisis of internal conservative nationalism and external nationalist conflict that had racked Europe since 1914, and it unleashed a horrific devastation that left no European untouched. With the perspective of 70 years distance in time, how do historians now view its significance in the course of the 20th century? Theme 3. I always tell my undergraduate history students that one of the few real influences that professional historians have, we're fundamentally irrelevant people, is the power that we possess to periodize and name periods of history. You're all aware, of course, that the very term Renaissance is the coining of the great Swiss cultural historian Jakob Burckhardt. Yet it has become a Ding an sich, Ding an und für sich, probably. It has become a reified reality, despite the fact that it's an invention of a historian. We like to think we have this influence. European historians regularly now teach the so-called long 19th century. I'm teaching that in German history this term, which begins in 1789 and ends in 1914. Thomas Nipperdey's text, Germany in the 19th Century, begins, "In the beginning was Napoleon." Can you imagine a historian brave enough to start his history text with the beginning of both the Hebrew scriptures and the Gospel of John? In the beginning, Anfang war Napoleon. And we also teach a short 20th century, 1914 to 1989 or to 1991. At the end of the calendar-defined 20th century, a group of historians has made the first efforts to summarize an interpretation of Europe's experience in that tumultuous century. They wrote in the late 90s and early 2000s, colored by the unexpected resurgence of conservative nationalism, warfare, and indeed genocide in the Balkans. First between Serbia and Croatia in Slavonia, then even more murderously in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and finally with full NATO intervention to stop reciprocal murders between Serbs and Kosovar Albanians in Kosovo. This first wave of histories reached dark conclusions. Mark Matzover at Columbia calls his synthesis Dark Continent, Europe's 20th Century. Richard Vinan at King's College London titles his A History in Fragments, Europe in the 20th Century. And Bernard Wasserstein at Chicago uses a straightforward Barbarism and Civilization, a history of Europe in our time. No Whiggish interpretation of European history as the working out of progress on the world stage is possible after September 1st, 1939. As Wasserstein's title suggests, these historians don't view the entire period negatively, but all agree that Europe's 20th century was dominated in the first half by nationalist warfare, economic crisis, class conflict, and barbarous murder, and dominated in the second half by a Cold War in which the domination of external superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, divided Europe, repressed freedoms in the East, and maintained the absence of open warfare only by the threat of mutual assured destruction. And the troubles in the Balkans that emerged as soon as the events removed the lid from the pressure cooker after the collapse of the Soviet Empire and then the Soviet Union, seemingly presaged a broader resurgence of pre-war distempers. So the perspective of these histories extrapolates from W.H. Auden's characterization of the decade of the 30s as a low, dishonest decade. And they apply that epithet to the whole of the 20th century experience in Europe. In their account, September 1st stands only as the midpoint of a savage century. And yet, while chastened and far from Panglossian, neither these authors nor I remain as pessimistic as their titles and this sketch of their interpretation may suggest. And I'd like to close by noting three post-1945 developments in Europe, all emphasized by yet another historian's account of European history, which may come to be seen as the historical foundation for a future brighter than this recent European past. Europe in 1945 was prostrate, exhausted, devastated, and bankrupt. Germany ceased to exist, divided among four wartime allies. Italy and France were racked with class-based political strife and by paroxysms of retribution for fascism in the one case and collaboration with the Nazis in the other. Britain was bankrupt, maintaining rationing until 1954, and both Britain and France struggled mightily but vainly to reassert and then maintain their holds on their pre-war empires. And as the Soviets asserted greater control of the governments of the states in their East European sphere of influence, Winston Churchill, the politician who had agreed to that sphere of influence at Moscow in 1944, condemned it in 1946 as the erection of an Iron Curtain from Stettin to Trieste. Between 1945 and 89, or certainly between 1948-49 and 1989, the central fact of European life was that the Cold War struggle between the superpowers of the United States and Soviet Union rendered Europe irrelevant as anything other than a theater in that worldwide competition. And it made internal European military conflict conceptually impossible. In the East, there could of course be no conflicts within the international solidarity of proletarian republics building real existing socialism. War is a capitalist phenomenon. In a socialist utopia, there can be no war. And in the West, any conflict not only seemed self-defeating in itself, but would weaken the survival of all against the paramount threat in the East.